Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the parking lot, watching the last guests enter the elegant venue through floor-to-ceiling windows. The Riverside Manor's garden sparkled with thousands of fairy lights, and she could see her sister Victoria gliding across the dance floor in an ivory gown that probably cost more than most people's cars. 5 years had passed since Sarah last saw her family, 5 years since the explosive confrontation that had torn their world apart. Now she was back, uninvited but determined, carrying a small wrapped box that contained the power to destroy everything Victoria held dear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Chen family had always been a picture of success in the affluent suburbs of Westchester County, New York. Their sprawling Tudor-style home sat on 3 acres of meticulously maintained grounds, complete with a koi pond and tennis court that Victoria had insisted they needed for entertaining. Their father, Dr. Michael Chen, was a renowned neurosurgeon at Mount Sinai Hospital, while their mother, Grace Chen, ran one of the most successful interior design firms in the tri-state area. From the outside, they were the embodiment of the American dream achieved through hard work and determination. Sarah had grown up believing in that dream, working tirelessly to live up to the family's exacting standards. As the older sister by 3 years, she had always felt the weight of expectation more heavily. Perfect grades weren't enough, she needed to be valedictorian. Playing piano well wasn't sufficient, she had to win state competitions. Being accepted to college was baseline. It had to be an Ivy League school with a full scholarship. Victoria, meanwhile, seemed to glide through life effortlessly, her natural charm and stunning looks opening doors that Sarah had to kick down through sheer force of will. Their childhood had been one of structured excellence: morning piano practice before school, Mandarin lessons on weekends, volunteer work at the hospital during summers, and carefully curated social activities that would look impressive on college applications. Sarah excelled academically, but Victoria possessed something more valuable in their social circle: the ability to make everything look effortless. While Sarah sweated over every test and assignment, Victoria maintained perfect grades while also serving as student body president, dating the quarterback, and somehow finding time to model for local boutiques. The sisters had been close despite their different approaches to success. Sarah protected Victoria from their parents' more demanding expectations, often taking on extra responsibilities so her younger sister could maintain her social life. Victoria, in return, helped Sarah navigate the complex social hierarchies of their elite private school, teaching her how to dress, how to speak to boys, and how to project confidence even when she felt uncertain. Their parents' marriage had always been more of a business partnership than a romantic union. Dr. Chen's demanding schedule at the hospital meant he was rarely home, while Grace channeled her considerable energy into building her design empire. They functioned like a well-oiled machine, each playing their role in maintaining the family's status and reputation. Dinners were formal affairs, where academic achievements were discussed like quarterly earnings reports, and family vacations were planned around networking opportunities and photo sessions for Grace's social media presence. Sarah first noticed the cracks in their perfect facade during her senior year of high school. She had been accepted to Harvard with a pre-med track, fulfilling her father's dream of having another doctor in the family. Victoria was a sophomore, already being courted by modeling agencies and Ivy League admissions officers. Everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan until Sarah stumbled upon information that would shatter her understanding of her family forever. It happened on a Saturday afternoon when she was home alone, working on college scholarship applications in her father's study. She had been looking for his tax returns to complete financial aid forms when she discovered a hidden folder in his desk drawer. Inside were bank statements for accounts she had never heard of, correspondence with offshore investment firms, and, most damning of all, detailed records of what appeared to be a sophisticated insurance fraud scheme involving fake medical procedures and inflated billing. The documents revealed that Dr. Chen had been systematically defrauding insurance companies for years, performing unnecessary procedures on wealthy patients who were more concerned with exclusivity than medical necessity. He had built an entire parallel practice catering to Manhattan's elite, offering experimental treatments and cosmetic procedures that were billed as medically necessary surgeries. The profits from these fraudulent activities had funded their luxurious lifestyle, Victoria's modeling portfolio, and Sarah's private school tuition. Sarah spent hours poring over the documents, her medical knowledge from years of hospital volunteering helping her understand the implications. Patients had undergone risky surgeries they didn't need. Insurance companies had been bilked out of millions of dollars. Her father had violated his Hippocratic oath in the most fundamental way possible, putting profit above patient welfare. The worst part was realizing that their family's entire foundation was built on lies and exploitation. The discovery left Sarah feeling sick and confused. Everything she had worked for, every achievement she had earned, was tainted by the knowledge that it had been funded through fraud. Her Harvard acceptance felt hollow, knowing that her application essays about her father's dedication to healing were based on a complete fabrication. She spent sleepless nights trying to decide what to do with the information, torn between loyalty to her family and her own moral compass. She decided to confront her father directly, hoping there might be some explanation that would make sense of what she had found. The conversation took place in his study on a Sunday evening, the same room where she had discovered his crimes. Dr. Chen's reaction was swift and devastating. Rather than denial or explanation, he immediately went on the attack. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said, his voice cold and controlled. "Everything we have, everything you've accomplished, exists because I made difficult decisions that you're too naive to understand." Sarah tried to argue that what he was doing was wrong, that people were being hurt by his actions. Her father's response was to detail exactly how much her education had cost, how much money had been spent on her piano lessons and tutoring, how her entire life had been subsidized by his work. He made it clear that questioning him was not just ungrateful but dangerous. "You have two choices," he said, locking the incriminating documents back in his desk. "You can continue to benefit from the opportunities I've provided and keep your mouth shut, or you can throw away everything we've built for your family because of some misguided sense of righteousness." The confrontation escalated when Victoria entered the study, drawn by raised voices. Sarah, emotional and desperate for support, tried to explain what she had discovered. Victoria's reaction was not what she expected. Instead of shock or outrage, her younger sister showed frustration and annoyance. "Why do you always have to complicate everything?" Victoria demanded. "Dad works incredibly hard to give us this life. Why can't you just be grateful instead of looking for problems?" Sarah realized with growing horror that Victoria already knew about their father's activities. The two of them had discussed it, and Victoria had chosen to accept it as the price of their lifestyle. Her younger sister, the person she had protected and guided throughout their childhood, was willing to be complicit in fraud as long as it benefited her. The argument that followed was brutal and definitive. Dr. Chen made it clear that Sarah's acceptance to Harvard could be rescinded with a single phone call to the admissions office, explaining that the family's financial situation had drastically changed. Her mother, summoned by the commotion, sided immediately with her husband, pointing out that Sarah's moral stance would destroy not just her own future, but Victoria's as well. "Think about your sister," Grace pleaded. "Victoria has modeling contracts being offered, college interviews scheduled. Are you really going to ruin her chances because you can't accept that the world is more complicated than your teenage idealism?" Sarah found herself completely isolated, facing a family that had chosen financial security over ethical behavior. The message was clear: conform or be cut off entirely. That night, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Rather than submit to what she saw as blackmail, she chose to expose her father's crimes to the authorities. The next morning, while her family was at Victoria's school event, Sarah drove to the Manhattan District Attorney's office with copies of all the documents she had found. She met with a prosecutor who specialized in healthcare fraud, turning over evidence that would eventually lead to one of the largest medical fraud cases in New York State history. The investigation moved quickly once authorities had Sarah's evidence. Within 2 weeks, federal agents raided Dr. Chen's office and their family home, seizing financial records and computer files. The local news covered the story extensively, with headlines about the prominent surgeon accused of defrauding insurance companies out of millions of dollars. Sarah's family's reaction was swift and merciless. Dr. Chen used his remaining influence to have her expelled from their private school, claiming she had stolen confidential medical documents. Her Harvard acceptance was indeed rescinded after he contacted the admissions office to report that Sarah was facing potential criminal charges for theft. Her parents froze her college fund and credit cards, effectively cutting off all financial support. The final confrontation took place in the living room of their Westchester home, with Victoria standing silently beside their parents as Dr. Chen delivered his ultimatum. Sarah had betrayed the family in the most fundamental way possible, he declared. She had chosen strangers over her own blood, abstract principles over the people who had sacrificed everything for her success. "You're no longer my daughter," he said with devastating finality. "You've made your choice, and now you'll live with the consequences. Don't contact us, don't use our name, and don't expect any help when your righteous principles leave you with nothing." Victoria said nothing during this confrontation, but her silence spoke volumes. The sister who had once relied on Sarah's protection and guidance was now choosing the family's wealth and status over their relationship. Sarah realized that Victoria had never shared her moral concerns about their father's activities. She had simply been willing to look the other way as long as the benefits continued. That night, Sarah packed a single suitcase with her essential belongings and left the only home she had ever known. At 18 years old, she had no family support, no college prospects, and no financial resources. Her principled stand had cost her everything, but she couldn't bring herself to regret the decision. Living with the knowledge of her father's crimes while continuing to benefit from them had felt impossible. The first year after leaving home was the most difficult period of Sarah's life. She found a small apartment in Queens, sharing space with 3 other girls who were also struggling to make ends meet. She worked 2 jobs to pay rent and buy food, cleaning office buildings at night and working as a cashier at a grocery store during the day. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, but the emotional isolation was worse. She had lost not just her family, but her entire social circle. Friends from her private school sided with Victoria's version of events, which painted Sarah as unstable and ungrateful. The few who reached out initially stopped calling when it became clear that associating with her meant potential social suicide in their wealthy community. Sarah learned that her former friends' parents had been warned that she was troubled and might be a bad influence on their own children. Despite the hardships, Sarah refused to compromise her principles or return to her family with an apology. She enrolled in community college using financial aid and student loans, determined to rebuild her educational future from scratch. Her grades were excellent, but the path forward seemed impossibly difficult without family connections or financial support. The breakthrough came during her second year of community college when she met Professor Elena Rodriguez, who taught investigative journalism. Professor Rodriguez recognized Sarah's intelligence and determination, taking her under her wing as a mentor and advocate. When Sarah finally shared her story about exposing her father's fraud, Professor Rodriguez was impressed rather than judgmental. "You chose truth over comfort," Professor Rodriguez told her. "That's the foundation of real journalism. The world needs more people willing to make difficult ethical choices, even when it costs them personally." Under Professor Rodriguez's guidance, Sarah transferred to Columbia University's journalism program with a substantial scholarship. She excelled in investigative reporting, drawn to stories about corruption and abuse of power. Her personal experience with family betrayal and institutional fraud gave her unique insight into the psychology of whistleblowing and the costs of speaking truth to power. During her junior year at Columbia, Sarah began working as an intern at a respected investigative news organization. Her editors were impressed by her tenacity and attention to detail, particularly on stories involving financial crimes and healthcare fraud. She had found her calling in exposing the kind of corruption that had destroyed her family relationships, but aligned with her moral convictions.
Sarah's career advanced rapidly after graduation. She joined the investigative team at a major New York newspaper, where her reporting on municipal corruption and corporate fraud earned recognition and awards. Her colleagues respected her thorough research methods and fearless approach to powerful targets. She had built a reputation as someone who couldn't be intimidated or bought off, characteristics that served her well in investigative journalism. By her late 20s, Sarah had become one of the most respected investigative reporters in the city. Her work had led to several high-profile prosecutions and policy changes. She lived in a comfortable Manhattan apartment, had a close circle of friends who shared her values, and felt fulfilled by work that made a real difference in people's lives. She had built a successful life on her own terms, without compromising her principles or accepting money that came from unethical sources. The only shadow over her success was the complete absence of family relationships. Sarah had made no attempt to contact her parents or Victoria during the 5 years since leaving home. She occasionally saw their names in society pages or business news, but she avoided learning details about their lives. Dr. Chen had served 2 years in federal prison for healthcare fraud before being released on parole. Grace's interior design business had survived the scandal, apparently benefiting from clients who appreciated her ability to maintain discretion. Victoria had continued modeling while attending NYU, building a social media presence and dating wealthy men from prominent families. Sarah told herself that she was better off without family members who had chosen wealth over ethics. She had built meaningful relationships with colleagues, friends, and mentors who respected her values. Professor Rodriguez remained a close confidant, and Sarah had developed romantic relationships with people who admired her integrity rather than her family connections. She felt proud of what she had accomplished independently. The news of Victoria's engagement came through a former classmate who sent Sarah a link to the announcement in the society pages. Victoria Chen was marrying Bradley Whitmore III, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune and son of a prominent political family. The engagement photos showed Victoria looking radiant beside a handsome man in an expensive suit, posed in front of what appeared to be a mansion in the Hamptons. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions reading about her sister's upcoming wedding. Part of her was genuinely happy that Victoria had found love and success.
Another part felt sad about missing such a significant milestone in her sister's life. But there was also a cynical recognition that Victoria had chosen exactly the kind of marriage their parents would approve of: wealthy, well-connected, and socially advantageous. She might have left it at that, content to observe her family's lives from a distance, if not for the investigation that landed on her desk 2 months before Victoria's wedding. Sarah's editor assigned her to look into allegations of price-fixing and illegal marketing practices at Whitmore Pharmaceuticals, the company that would soon be her sister's new family business. The investigation revealed a pattern of corporate malfeasance that went back decades. Whitmore Pharmaceuticals had been systematically inflating drug prices, paying bribes to doctors to prescribe their medications unnecessarily, and suppressing research about dangerous side effects. The company had been particularly aggressive in marketing opioid painkillers, contributing significantly to the addiction crisis that had devastated communities across the country. Bradley Whitmore III was not just an innocent heir to the family fortune, he was actively involved in the company's most unethical practices. Sarah's sources revealed that he had personally overseen marketing campaigns that targeted vulnerable populations, including elderly patients and people with chronic pain conditions. He had knowledge of studies showing his company's drugs were addictive and potentially dangerous, but he had worked to suppress that information to protect profits. The parallels to her father's crimes were impossible to ignore. Once again, Sarah found herself investigating healthcare professionals who put profit above patient welfare. The difference was that this time, the corruption was connected to her sister's new family. Victoria was about to marry into the same kind of institutional fraud that had torn their original family apart. Sarah faced an ethical dilemma that kept her awake at night. Her professional obligation was to publish the investigation, exposing Whitmore Pharmaceuticals' crimes and Bradley's role in them. But doing so would destroy Victoria's engagement and wedding, potentially leaving her sister heartbroken and humiliated.
After 5 years of separation, Sarah would once again be the person who brought down Victoria's carefully constructed life. She consulted with Professor Rodriguez, who listened thoughtfully to Sarah's concerns before offering her perspective. "You can't protect Victoria from the truth," she said. "If she's marrying someone involved in systematic healthcare fraud, she deserves to know who he really is. The question is whether you're going to let personal relationships compromise your professional integrity." Professor Rodriguez was right, but the decision still felt agonizing. Sarah had already lost her family once by choosing truth over loyalty. Exposing Bradley's crimes would likely ensure that any possibility of reconciliation with Victoria would be permanently destroyed. Her sister would probably see it as another act of betrayal, more evidence that Sarah cared more about abstract principles than family relationships. After weeks of internal struggle, Sarah made her decision. She would complete the investigation and publish the story, but she would give Victoria advance warning about what was coming. It seemed like the least she could do for the sister she had once protected and loved. She would attend the wedding uninvited, present Victoria with evidence of Bradley's crimes, and let her decide how to handle the information. Sarah spent her savings on an expensive dress and arranged to have the investigation's key findings compiled into a small folder that would fit in a gift box. She wasn't going to ambush Victoria publicly or create a scene at the wedding. Instead, she would present the evidence privately and let her sister make an informed decision about her future. It was the kind of protection she had once provided freely, adapted to their new circumstances. The plan felt both necessary and terrifying. Sarah knew she was risking her career by potentially compromising an ongoing investigation. She was also risking her emotional well-being by confronting a family that had already rejected her once. But she couldn't stand by and watch Victoria marry someone who was profiting from the same kind of healthcare fraud that had destroyed their father. Some responsibilities transcend personal relationships, and protecting people from predators was one of them. The night before the wedding, Sarah lay awake in her Manhattan apartment, alternating between confidence in her decision and terror about the potential consequences. Tomorrow would determine whether her relationship with Victoria could be salvaged or whether it would be permanently severed. Either way, she would know that she had tried to protect her sister one last time, even if Victoria no longer wanted her protection. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful, with the kind of perfect autumn weather that seemed designed for outdoor celebrations. Sarah drove to Westchester County in her modest Honda Civic, the wrapped gift box containing evidence of Bradley's crimes sitting on the passenger seat beside her. She had rehearsed what she would say to Victoria, but she knew that no amount of preparation could fully prepare her for the emotional impact of seeing her family again. As she parked outside the Riverside Manor and watched guests in designer clothes enter the venue, Sarah felt the weight of 5 years of separation settling on her shoulders. She was no longer the desperate teenager who had fled her family home with nothing but her principles to sustain her. She was a successful journalist who had built a meaningful life on her own terms. But she was also still Victoria's older sister, carrying the same protective instincts that had defined their childhood relationship. Taking a deep breath, Sarah picked up the gift box and walked toward the venue entrance, ready to face whatever consequences her decision would bring. The truth had cost her everything once before, but it had also given her the freedom to become who she was meant to be. Now it was time to offer Victoria the same choice, even if her sister ultimately rejected both the truth and the person bringing it to her. The security guard at the entrance barely glanced at Sarah as she approached, his attention focused on checking names against the guest list for a steady stream of arrivals. She had timed her arrival carefully, arriving during the cocktail hour, when the chaos of multiple entrances would provide cover for her uninvited presence. The elegant script on the invitation she had seen online indicated that dinner would begin at 7, giving her roughly an hour to locate Victoria and deliver her warning before the evening's formal events began. Sarah slipped past the entrance checkpoint by following closely behind a large family group, her confident stride and expensive dress making her appear to belong among the affluent guests. The Riverside Manor's interior was even more impressive than its exterior suggested, with soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered stunning views of the Hudson River. Ice sculptures shaped like swans graced the entrance hall, while servers in black tie attire circulated with champagne and elaborate hors d'oeuvres. The guest list appeared to be a who's who of New York's social and political elite. Sarah recognized several faces from newspaper society pages: pharmaceutical executives, political donors, federal judges, and Manhattan socialites whose names appeared regularly in charity event coverage. She spotted Senator Patricia Whitmore, Bradley's aunt, holding court near the bar while surrounded by admirers. The senator's presence explained the unusually heavy security presence Sarah had noticed outside the venue. Moving through the crowd with practiced journalist skills, Sarah observed and listened while appearing to belong. Conversations revolved around upcoming elections, pharmaceutical industry regulatory changes, and gossip about other wealthy families' latest scandals. She overheard one group discussing recent FDA investigations into drug pricing, with several pharmaceutical executives expressing confidence that their political connections would protect them from serious consequences. The casual corruption in their conversation made Sarah's stomach turn, reinforcing her determination to expose Bradley's crimes. She finally spotted Victoria across the room, radiant in an off-the-shoulder designer gown that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. Her sister was surrounded by bridesmaids in coordinating dusty rose dresses, all of them laughing at something Victoria had said. Even from a distance, Sarah could see that Victoria had grown more beautiful and sophisticated during their 5-year separation. Her posture was perfect, her smile confident, her gestures graceful in a way that suggested years of finishing school and deportment lessons. Bradley Whitmore III stood beside Victoria, tall and conventionally handsome in his custom tuxedo. Sarah had studied his photograph extensively during her investigation, but seeing him in person added dimension to her understanding of his character. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had never been denied anything, his hand possessively resting on Victoria's lower back as he spoke. His laugh was loud and frequent, the kind of performative joviality that seemed to demonstrate his comfort in any social situation. Sarah noticed her parents before they saw her, and the sight of them after 5 years hit her harder than she had expected. Dr. Michael Chen looked older and more frail than she remembered, his hair completely gray now and his posture slightly stooped.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The federal prison sentence had clearly taken its toll, aging him beyond his 62 years. Grace Chen remained elegant and well-dressed, but there was a brittle quality to her smile that suggested the family scandals had affected her more than she wanted to admit. They stood together near the edge of the reception area, looking somewhat isolated from the other guests, despite their expensive clothing and forced smiles. The sight of her parents triggered a flood of complex emotions that Sarah had thought she had processed years ago. Anger at their betrayal, mixed with unexpected sadness at seeing how much they had aged. She felt a momentary impulse to approach them, to attempt some kind of reconciliation, but she quickly suppressed it. They had made their choice 5 years ago, prioritizing wealth and status over ethics and family loyalty. Her presence here wasn't about them, it was about protecting Victoria from making the same mistakes. As Sarah moved closer to where Victoria was holding court, she was intercepted by someone she hadn't expected to see. Marcus Rivera, a former classmate from her private school days, appeared at her elbow with a look of genuine surprise and pleasure. "Sarah Chen, as I live and breathe," he said, embracing her warmly. "I can't believe you're here. Victoria said you couldn't make it." Sarah's mind raced as she processed this information. Victoria had told people she couldn't attend rather than admitting she hadn't been invited. This suggested either shame about their estrangement or a desire to avoid awkward questions about family drama. Either way, it gave Sarah a cover story for her presence. "Last-minute change of plans," Sarah replied carefully. "Work situation got resolved sooner than expected." Marcus, who had grown into a successful investment banker based on his expensive suit and confident demeanor, seemed genuinely pleased to see her. They had been friendly in high school, though never particularly close given their different social circles. He updated her on various classmates' careers and marriages, while she half listened, her attention focused on finding an opportunity to approach Victoria privately. "Your sister looks absolutely stunning," Marcus continued. "Bradley's a lucky guy. Though I have to admit, some of us were surprised by the engagement.
Victoria always seemed more interested in creative types, artists and writers and such. Bradley's more of the corporate dynasty type. This observation intrigued Sarah. During their childhood, Victoria had indeed been drawn to creative pursuits, spending hours sketching and writing poetry. Their parents had tolerated these interests as long as they didn't interfere with more practical goals, but they had never encouraged artistic development. The idea that Victoria might be sacrificing her authentic interests for a socially advantageous marriage added another layer of complexity to Sarah's mission. People change, Sarah replied diplomatically. Sometimes security becomes more important than passion. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. True enough. Though I always thought you two would end up closer, You were so protective of her in school. Some of us used to joke that getting to Victoria meant going through Sarah first. The comment hit Sarah harder than Marcus could have intended. She had indeed been fiercely protective of Victoria throughout their childhood, running interference with their demanding parents and helping her sister navigate social challenges. The irony that she was once again trying to protect Victoria, but now from Victoria's own choices, wasn't lost on her. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of chimes, indicating that guests should move to the dining room for the reception dinner. Sarah realized her window for private conversation with Victoria was closing rapidly. The formal dinner would make it impossible to approach her sister without causing a scene, and she needed to present the evidence before Victoria made any public commitments or statements about her new marriage. "Excuse me, Marcus," Sarah said quickly. "I need to find the ladies' room before dinner starts." She moved through the crowd toward the restroom areas, hoping to intercept Victoria before the formal events began. The manor's layout was confusing, with multiple corridors leading to different wings of the building. Sarah finally found a quiet hallway near what appeared to be a bridal preparation area, based on the "reserved for wedding party" signs posted on several doors. Victoria emerged from one of these rooms just as Sarah was debating whether to knock, and the sisters came face to face for the first time in 5 years. Victoria's expression cycled rapidly through recognition, shock, confusion, and what might have been relief before settling into careful neutrality. She looked even more beautiful up close, her makeup professionally applied, and her hair styled in an elegant updo that showcased diamond earrings that probably cost more than Sarah's car. "Sarah," Victoria said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone, "what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," Sarah replied, grateful that Victoria seemed more curious than angry. "Privately. It's important." Victoria hesitated, clearly torn between curiosity about her sister's unexpected appearance and concern about the timing. The formal dinner was about to begin, and her absence would be noticed quickly. But something in Sarah's expression must have convinced her that this wasn't a casual reunion attempt. "There's a small library down this hall," Victoria said finally. "We can have a few minutes before I have to get back." The library was a cozy room lined with leather-bound books and furnished with antique chairs and a mahogany desk. Victoria closed the door behind them and turned to face her sister directly. In the soft lamplight, Sarah could see that Victoria looked tired beneath her flawless makeup, and there were subtle lines of stress around her eyes that hadn't been there during their teenage years. "You look good," Victoria said, and Sarah detected genuine warmth in her voice. "Successful. I've seen your articles in the paper. Dad doesn't know I read them, but I do." This admission caught Sarah off guard. She had assumed that Victoria would avoid anything connected to her sister's career, given the family's attitude toward her investigative work. The fact that Victoria had been following her professional success suggested that their connection hadn't been completely severed by their parents' ultimatum. "Thank you," Sarah replied. "You look beautiful. Happy." Victoria's smile faltered slightly.
"I am happy. Bradley's wonderful. His family has been incredibly welcoming. It's everything I dreamed about growing up." But something in her tone suggested uncertainty, a quality that reminded Sarah of how Victoria used to sound when she was trying to convince herself of something she didn't entirely believe. During their childhood, Victoria had used that same tone when insisting she enjoyed piano competitions or that she wasn't nervous about social events their parents forced her to attend. "Victoria, I'm here because I need to tell you something about Bradley," Sarah said, deciding to be direct rather than building up to her revelation gradually. "Something you need to know before you go through with this marriage." Victoria's expression immediately became defensive. If this is about his family's money or their political connections, I already know all of that. I'm not naive, Sarah. I understand what kind of family I'm marrying into. It's not about money or politics, Sarah said, reaching into her purse for the wrapped box. It's about criminal activity, healthcare fraud specifically. Bradley and his family have been systematically defrauding patients and insurance companies for years. Victoria's face went pale, and she sank into one of the leather chairs as if her legs wouldn't support her. "What are you talking about?" Sarah sat across from her and carefully explained what her investigation had uncovered about Whitmore Pharmaceuticals. She detailed the price-fixing schemes, the illegal marketing practices, and the suppression of safety data that had led to patient deaths. She explained Bradley's personal involvement in these activities, his knowledge of the company's crimes, and his active participation in covering them up. "The evidence is all here," Sarah said, placing the wrapped box on the table between them. "Financial records, internal communications, testimony from former employees, everything you need to understand who you're really marrying." Victoria stared at the box as if it contained a bomb, which in many ways it did. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for it, then pulled back without touching it. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of shared history and divergent choices. "Why are you doing this?" Victoria finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why now, today, on my wedding day?" "Because you're my sister," Sarah replied. "Because I love you, and I can't stand by and watch you marry someone who profits from the same kind of healthcare fraud that destroyed our father. Because you deserve to know the truth about who Bradley really is before you legally bind yourself to him and his family." Victoria looked up sharply. "The same kind of fraud? Sarah, what Dad did was wrong, but it wasn't the same as what you're describing. He was just creative with billing practices." Sarah realized that Victoria had never fully understood the scope of their father's crimes. The family's version of events had minimized Dr. Chen's actions, presenting them as technical violations rather than the systematic patient abuse they actually represented. Victoria had been protected from the worst details, allowing her to rationalize their father's behavior as acceptable moral compromise. "Victoria, Dad performed unnecessary surgeries on elderly patients," Sarah explained gently. "People died because of procedures they didn't need. He falsified medical records to justify dangerous interventions. It wasn't creative billing, it was systematic patient abuse motivated by greed." The color drained completely from Victoria's face as the full implications of their father's crimes became clear to her for the first time. She had spent 5 years believing that Sarah had destroyed their family over minor financial irregularities, when in reality, their father had been directly responsible for patient deaths through fraudulent medical practices. "I didn't know," Victoria whispered. "They told me it was just insurance issues, that you were being dramatic about paperwork violations." Sarah felt a surge of protective anger toward their parents for lying to Victoria about the true nature of their father's crimes. They had manipulated her into believing that Sarah's ethical stance was unreasonable, when in reality, she had been trying to prevent further patient deaths. Victoria had been as much a victim of their parents' deception as Sarah had been a victim of their rejection. "They lied to you," Sarah softly, "just like they're lying to themselves about what Dad did. And now you're about to marry into a family that's committing the same kinds of crimes on an even larger scale." Victoria picked up the wrapped box with shaking hands, staring at it as if she could see through the packaging to the damning evidence inside. "How do I know this is real? How do I know you're not just trying to sabotage my wedding because you're angry about what happened 5 years ago?" The question stung, but Sarah understood Victoria's skepticism. From her sister's perspective, Sarah had already destroyed their family once by exposing uncomfortable truths. It would be natural to assume that this was another attack motivated by personal grievances rather than genuine concern. "Because I'm a professional journalist with a reputation to protect," Sarah replied. "Because everything in that box has been verified by multiple sources and will be published whether or not you decide to go through with this wedding. And because despite everything that's happened between us, I still care enough about you to warn you before it becomes public knowledge." Victoria slowly unwrapped the box, revealing a folder containing selected documents from Sarah's investigation.
She opened it and began reading, her expression growing more horrified with each page. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Financial records showing fraudulent billing practices, internal emails discussing strategies to suppress safety data, and testimony from former employees detailing Bradley's personal involvement in criminal activities. There are families who lost their children to opioid addictions because Whitmore Pharmaceuticals knowingly marketed dangerous drugs. There are elderly patients who died from medications they didn't need because doctors were paid to prescribe them. Bradley knew about all of this. He helped orchestrate the cover-ups. Victoria closed the folder and sat in stunned silence, tears beginning to streak her carefully applied makeup. The weight of the revelation was clearly overwhelming, particularly coming on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Sarah felt a familiar protective instinct rising, the same impulse that had driven her to shield Victoria from their parents' worst demands during their childhood.
"What am I supposed to do with this?" Victoria asked, her voice breaking. "The wedding is happening right now. There are 300 guests in the next room. Bradley's family has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on this event. My dress costs more than most people's cars." Sarah leaned forward, taking her sister's hands in her own. "You're supposed to make a choice based on who you want to be, not on what other people have invested in your decision. You can walk away from this right now. You can call off the wedding and deal with the consequences, or you can go through with marrying someone whose wealth comes from causing other people's deaths." "It's not that simple," Victoria protested. "His family isn't just wealthy, they're powerful. If I humiliate them publicly, they'll destroy me. They have connections everywhere: media, politics, business. They could ruin my career, my reputation, my future." Sarah recognized the fear in Victoria's voice, the same paralysis that had once kept their mother silent about their father's affairs and crimes. The Whitmore family represented the kind of institutional power that could indeed make life very difficult for someone who crossed them. But Sarah also knew that giving into that fear meant becoming complicit in their crimes. "They can only destroy you if you let them," Sarah said firmly. "If you have the truth on your side and the courage to stand by it, I know it's scary. I know it seems impossible, but I also know that you're stronger than you think you are." Victoria looked at her sister with a mixture of gratitude and resentment. "Easy for you to say. You've already lost everything once. You know you can survive being cut off from family money and social connections. I've never had to live without that safety net." The observation was fair and painful. Sarah had been forced to develop independence and resilience because she'd had no choice, while Victoria had remained within the family's protective bubble. The prospect of losing that security was genuinely terrifying for someone who had never experienced financial or social vulnerability. "You're right," Sarah admitted. "I don't know what it's like to walk away from the kind of life you've always known. But I do know what it's like to live with the knowledge that you chose comfort over conscience. And I know which choice lets you sleep at night." A knock on the library door interrupted their conversation, followed by the voice of what sounded like a wedding coordinator. "Victoria, everyone's looking for you. They're ready to begin the dinner service." Victoria quickly wiped her tears and attempted to repair her makeup using a compact mirror from her purse. The practical demands of the wedding were reasserting themselves, pulling her back toward the celebration that awaited in the dining room. But Sarah could see that the evidence had fundamentally changed her sister's understanding of the situation. "I need more time to think," Victoria said, standing and smoothing her dress. "This is too much to process all at once." "Time is the one thing you don't have," Sarah replied gently. "Every moment you delay makes it harder to change course. Once you go through with the ceremony, once you legally bind yourself to Bradley and his family, you become complicit in everything they've done." Victoria paused at the door, her hand on the handle. "Will you stay? For the dinner, I mean. Even if I decide to go through with the wedding?" The question surprised Sarah. She had assumed that delivering her warning would be the end of their interaction, regardless of Victoria's decision. The invitation to remain suggested that Victoria valued her presence despite the painful revelations she had brought. "Do you want me to stay?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," Victoria replied honestly.
Part of me wants you here, and part of me wants you to disappear so I can pretend this conversation never happened. But mostly, I just don't want to face this alone. Sarah felt the familiar pull of sisterly protection, the same instinct that had driven her to expose their father's crimes despite the personal cost. Victoria was facing an impossible choice, and regardless of what she decided, she would need support to deal with the consequences. "I'll stay," Sarah said. "Whatever you decide, I'll be here." Victoria nodded gratefully and opened the door, stepping back into the corridor that led to the reception. Sarah followed at a distance, giving her sister space to compose herself before rejoining the celebration. As they walked toward the dining room, Sarah noticed that Victoria's posture had changed subtly. The confident grace she had displayed earlier was replaced by a more tentative, uncertain bearing that suggested the weight of her new knowledge. The dining room was spectacular, with round tables draped in ivory linens and centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath. Crystal glasses caught the light from elaborate chandeliers, and the gentle murmur of 300 guests created an atmosphere of elegant celebration. Sarah found herself seated at a table near the back of the room, apparently having been added to the guest list at the last minute through Victoria's intervention. Bradley stood at the head table, clearly agitated by Victoria's prolonged absence. When she finally appeared, his relief was visible across the room. He pulled out her chair with exaggerated gallantry and whispered something in her ear that made her smile weakly. To the other guests, they probably looked like any other happy couple sharing an intimate moment. But Sarah could see the tension in Victoria's shoulders and the forced quality of her responses to Bradley's attention. The dinner proceeded with the elaborate formality typical of high society weddings. Multiple courses appeared and disappeared, while guests made polite conversation about topics designed to demonstrate their wealth and sophistication. Sarah found herself seated at a table near the back of the room, apparently having been added to the guest list at the last minute through Victoria's intervention. Bradley stood at the head table, clearly agitated by Victoria's prolonged absence. When she finally appeared, his relief was visible across the room. He pulled out her chair with exaggerated gallantry and whispered something in her ear that made her smile weakly. To the other guests, they probably looked like any other happy couple sharing an intimate moment. But Sarah could see the tension in Victoria's shoulders and the forced quality of her responses to Bradley's attention. The dinner proceeded with the elaborate formality typical of high society weddings. Multiple courses appeared and disappeared, while guests made polite conversation about topics designed to demonstrate their wealth and sophistication.
Sarah found herself seated with other distant relatives and family friends, people who knew enough about the Chen family history to be curious about her presence, but not enough to ask direct questions about the 5-year estrangement. She observed Bradley throughout the meal, watching for signs of the character flaws her investigation had revealed. He was charming and attentive to Victoria, engaging easily with other guests and telling amusing stories about their courtship. If Sarah hadn't known about his professional activities, she might have found him genuinely likable. The disconnect between his public persona and his private actions reminded her of their father's ability to compartmentalize his fraudulent medical practice from his family relationships. As the dinner courses progressed, Sarah noticed Victoria drinking more wine than seemed typical for a bride, who would need to remain composed for several more hours of celebration. Her sister's responses to Bradley's conversation became increasingly mechanical, and she kept glancing towards Sarah's table with an expression that mixed desperation with indecision. The moment of truth came when Bradley stood to make his toast to their engagement and upcoming ceremony. He spoke eloquently about meeting Victoria, about their shared values and common goals, about the bright future they would build together. His words were romantic and appropriate, but Sarah knew they were built on a foundation of lies and criminal activity. Victoria sat perfectly still during the toast, her smile never wavering, but her hands gripping her napkins so tightly her knuckles were white. When Bradley finished speaking to enthusiastic applause, Victoria slowly rose from her chair. The room fell silent as guests anticipated her reciprocal toast, but instead of reaching for her champagne glass, she reached for the microphone Bradley had just set down. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Victoria began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. "Your presence means the world to me, and I'm grateful for the love and support you've shown Bradley and me throughout our engagement." Sarah held her breath,
unsure whether Victoria was about to deliver a conventional bride's speech or follow through on the implications of their library conversation. The pause stretched on as Victoria seemed to gather her courage for what came next. However, I've recently learned some information about Bradley and his family that makes it impossible for me to proceed with this marriage in good conscience, Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I cannot and will not bind myself legally to someone whose wealth comes from activities that cause harm to vulnerable patients and families. The room erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps. Bradley's face went from confusion to alarm to fury in rapid succession. Senator Whitmore half rose from her seat, clearly prepared to intervene, while other guests looked around in bewilderment at this unprecedented breach of wedding protocol. Victoria held up her hand for silence and continued speaking. I know this is shocking and disappointing for everyone who has invested time and money in celebrating our relationship. But I've learned that living authentically requires difficult choices, and I would rather face temporary embarrassment than permanent compromise of my values. Bradley grabbed for the microphone, but Victoria stepped away from him, maintaining her position at the center of the room's attention. Victoria, you're obviously upset about something, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Let's discuss this privately. You're not thinking clearly right now. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months, Victoria replied firmly. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I know why I'm doing it. This marriage cannot and will not proceed. Sarah felt a surge of pride in her sister's courage, mixed with concern about the immediate consequences Victoria would face. The Whitmore family's wealth and power made them dangerous enemies, and publicly humiliating them at their own son's wedding would undoubtedly provoke retaliation. But Victoria had chosen truth over safety, just as Sarah had done 5 years earlier. The chaos that followed Victoria's announcement was swift and overwhelming. Bradley's groomsmen moved to surround him, clearly prepared to remove him from the situation before he could say something that would make the scandal worse. Senator Whitmore stood and began speaking quietly but urgently to other prominent guests, already beginning damage control efforts. Security personnel appeared throughout the room, though it wasn't clear whether they were there to protect the Whitmores or remove Victoria from the premises. Through it all, Victoria remained calm and composed, even as her parents pushed through the crowd to reach her. Dr. Chen looked furious, while Grace appeared to be in shock at this repeat of their family's pattern of public scandal. Sarah realized that Victoria was about to face the same kind of family ultimatum that had driven her out of their lives 5 years earlier. Victoria, what have you done? Dr. Chen demanded when he reached his daughter. Do you have any idea what kind of enemies you've just made? The Whitmores aren't the kind of people you can afford to cross. I know exactly what I've done, Victoria replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. I've chosen integrity over convenience, just like Sarah did 5 years ago. The mention of Sarah's name drew her parents' attention to her presence in the room for the first time. Dr. Chen's expression shifted from anger to something approaching rage when he spotted his older daughter sitting calmly at her table while his younger daughter destroyed another advantageous family alliance. You, he said, pointing directly at Sarah, this is your doing. You couldn't stand to see Victoria happy, so you sabotaged her wedding just like you sabotaged our family. Sarah stood and walked toward her parents and sister, aware that every eye in the room was following her movement. The confrontation she had been dreading for 5 years was finally happening, but she felt surprisingly calm about facing it. I didn't sabotage anything, Sarah replied quietly. I provided Victoria with information she needed to make an informed decision about her future, the same kind of information I tried to provide our family 5 years ago. Information, Dr. Chen spat. You mean lies and character assassination designed to destroy people who've done nothing but succeed in their chosen fields. People died because of the procedures you performed unnecessarily, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent room. Patients who trusted you suffered and died because you put profit above their welfare. That's not success, that's criminal negligence that landed you in federal prison. The blunt recitation of facts silenced Dr. Chen more effectively than any argument could have. Around them, wedding guests were beginning to understand that they were witnessing not just a canceled engagement, but the public airing of a family's deepest secrets and conflicts. Bradley, meanwhile, had apparently decided that his best strategy was to paint Victoria as emotionally unstable, rather than address the substance of her accusations. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying across the room, "Victoria is clearly under tremendous stress and not thinking rationally. These wild accusations are the product of pre-wedding nerves combined with her sister's well-documented history of mental instability and attention-seeking behavior." Sarah felt her temper flare at the attempt to discredit both her investigation and Victoria's decision-making capacity. "The accusations aren't wild and they're fully documented," she said. "Whitmore Pharmaceuticals has been systematically defrauding patients and insurance companies for years. Bradley personally oversaw marketing campaigns that contributed to the opioid crisis, while suppressing safety data that could have saved lives.
Everything I've told Victoria is supported by financial records, internal communications, and witness testimony that will be published regardless of what happens here tonight." The room fell into stunned silence as the implications of Sarah's words sank in. This wasn't just a family squabble or pre-wedding jitters. This was the public revelation of serious criminal allegations against one of the state's most prominent pharmaceutical families. Senator Whitmore stepped forward, her political instincts taking over as she attempted to regain control of the narrative. "Miss Chen, I don't know what vendetta you have against my family, but making false accusations at a private social event is both inappropriate and potentially actionable. I suggest you leave immediately before this situation escalates further." "The accusations aren't false, and I have no vendetta against your family," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm an investigative journalist doing my job, which is exposing healthcare fraud that harms vulnerable patients. Your nephew's criminal activities became newsworthy when he chose to commit them, not when I chose to investigate them." Victoria, who had been standing silently during this exchange, suddenly stepped forward. "Sarah didn't tell me anything that isn't true," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "I've seen the evidence. I know what Bradley and his family have done, and I refuse to be part of it." The simple statement, delivered with quiet conviction, seemed to deflate Bradley's attempts to discredit the situation. Here was his own fiancée, standing in front of 300 witnesses, confirming that the accusations against him were accurate. No amount of spin or damage control could overcome that kind of direct testimony. Security personnel were now moving through the room, apparently preparing to escort various people out before the situation could deteriorate further. Sarah realized that her time for family confrontation was running out, but she also understood that the most important work had already been done. Victoria had made her choice, standing up for her principles despite the personal cost. "Victoria," Sarah said, reaching out to take her sister's hand. "Are you ready to leave? This isn't going to get better, and staying longer will just make things worse." Victoria looked around the room one final time, taking in the shocked faces of family friends, the anger of her parents, and the fury of the Whitmore family members. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm ready to go." The sisters walked out of the Riverside Manor together, leaving behind a room full of stunned guests and a scandal that would dominate New York society pages for weeks to come. As they reached Sarah's car in the parking lot, Victoria finally broke down, the stress and adrenaline of the evening catching up with her all at once. Sarah held her sister as she sobbed, feeling the weight of protective love that had driven her to attend the wedding in the first place. Victoria had chosen the difficult path, just as Sarah had 5 years earlier, and now they would face the consequences together rather than alone. "What happens now?" Victoria asked through her tears. "Now we figure out what comes next," Sarah replied. "One day at a time, just like I did when I left home. But this time, you won't be doing it alone." The drive back to Manhattan took place mostly in silence, with Victoria curled against the passenger window, still wearing her wedding dress, now wrinkled and stained with tears. Sarah kept glancing over at her sister, concerned about the shock and emotional exhaustion that was clearly overwhelming her. The magnitude of what Victoria had just done was beginning to sink in as the adrenaline wore off, and Sarah could see her sister processing the reality of her situation.
When they reached Sarah's apartment, Victoria moved like someone in a trance, allowing Sarah to guide her upstairs and into the guest bedroom that would become her temporary refuge. Sarah found comfortable clothes for her sister to change into, then made tea while Victoria showered and tried to wash away the remnants of what should have been her wedding day. "I don't have anywhere to go," Victoria said when she finally emerged, her voice small and lost. "My apartment lease was up last month because I was supposed to move into Bradley's penthouse after the honeymoon. Most of my things are already there." Sarah felt a familiar surge of protective anger at the realization that Victoria had been systematically isolated and made financially dependent on the Whitmore family. It was a classic pattern of control, ensuring that walking away would be as difficult as possible. But Sarah also recognized the opportunity to help her sister build real independence for the first time in her life. "You can stay here as long as you need," Sarah assured her. "We'll figure out how to get your belongings back, and we'll help you find a new place when you're ready." The next few days passed in a blur of practical challenges and emotional recovery. Victoria's phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages from family members, former friends, and reporters who had gotten wind of the wedding scandal. Sarah screened the calls, protecting her sister from the worst of the harassment, while Victoria tried to process what had happened and figure out her next steps. The Whitmore family's retaliation was swift and predictable. By Monday morning, gossip columns were running stories about Victoria's mental breakdown and family history of instability. Social media accounts that had once celebrated her engagement were now filled with speculation about her motives and character. Several modeling contracts that had been pending were quietly withdrawn, and invitations to social events dried up completely. But there were also unexpected sources of support. Professor Rodriguez reached out after reading about the wedding cancellation, offering both professional opportunities and personal encouragement. Marcus Rivera called to check on Victoria's well-being and to offer his assistance navigating the financial aspects of disentangling herself from the Whitmore family. Most surprisingly, several former friends from their private school days reached out privately to express admiration for Victoria's courage in standing up to such a powerful family. Sarah's investigation into Whitmore Pharmaceuticals was published 3 days after the wedding, creating a media firestorm that made Victoria's canceled engagement seem like a minor footnote. Federal prosecutors announced they were opening a criminal investigation into the company's practices, with Bradley specifically named as a target. The stock price plummeted as investors fled, and several board members resigned to distance themselves from the scandal. Victoria read every article about the investigation, her understanding of Bradley's crimes deepening as more details emerged. "I almost married someone who profited from other people's deaths," she said one evening as they sat in Sarah's living room. "How did I not see who he really was?" "Because people like Bradley are experts at hiding their true nature," Sarah replied. "They present themselves as charming and successful while keeping their criminal activities separate from their personal relationships. You weren't supposed to see his real character. That was the whole point." The conversation led to deeper discussions about their family dynamics and the patterns of deception that had shaped both their lives. Victoria began to understand how their parents had manipulated her perception of events, protecting her from uncomfortable truths while simultaneously using her ignorance to justify their own choices. "They told me you were selfish for exposing Dad," Victoria confessed. "They said you cared more about being right than about protecting the family. But you were trying to protect people from getting hurt, weren't you?" Sarah nodded. "I couldn't stand by and watch Dad halt more patients just to maintain our lifestyle, and I couldn't live with benefiting from money that came from causing other people's suffering."
"I understand now," Victoria said quietly. "I'm sorry I didn't see it before. I'm sorry I chose them over you." The apology meant more to Sarah than she had expected. 5 years of estrangement and hurt began to heal as the sisters rebuilt their relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than family obligation. They talked late into the night about their childhood, their dreams, and their fears about the future. 2 weeks after the wedding that never happened, Victoria made a decision that surprised even Sarah.
She enrolled in a paralegal certification program, determined to use her experience with family secrets and corporate corruption to help other people navigate similar situations. "I want to work with families dealing with healthcare fraud," she explained. "I want to help people who are in the position I was in, who need someone to explain their options and support their decisions." Sarah was proud of her sister's choice, recognizing it as evidence of genuine growth and commitment to meaningful work. Victoria threw herself into her studies with the same determination she had once applied to maintaining social appearances, but now her energy was directed toward productive goals rather than empty status symbols. The Whitmore family's legal troubles continued to mount as federal investigators built their case. Bradley was indicted on multiple felony charges related to healthcare fraud, racketeering, and criminal conspiracy. His arrest made national news, with Victoria's canceled wedding mentioned as the first public indication that something was wrong with the pharmaceutical heir. Victoria received a subpoena to testify before the grand jury investigating the Whitmore family's crimes. She was nervous about the prospect of public testimony, but Sarah helped her prepare by explaining the legal process and the importance of her evidence to the prosecution's case. "Your decision to walk away from that marriage sent a message that people of conscience won't be complicit in their crimes," Sarah told her sister. "Your testimony could help ensure that Bradley and his family face consequences for what they've done." Victoria's testimony was compelling and effective. She spoke clearly about the evidence Sarah had shown her, her decision to call off the wedding, and her understanding of how the Whitmore family's wealth was connected to patient deaths and suffering. Her composed demeanor and obvious sincerity made a strong impression on both the grand jury and the media covering the proceedings. The trial that followed was a media sensation, with Victoria's dramatic wedding cancellation serving as a powerful symbol of someone choosing principles over profit. She handled the attention with grace, using her platform to advocate for stricter oversight of pharmaceutical companies and better protection for patients from fraudulent medical practices. Bradley was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, while other family members received lesser sentences for their roles in the conspiracy. Whitmore Pharmaceuticals was forced to pay billions in fines and victim compensation, with much of the company's assets seized to fund medical treatment for people harmed by their fraudulent practices. Sarah's relationship with her parents remained complicated. Dr. Chen and Grace eventually reached out after Victoria's testimony made national news, apparently hoping to reconcile with both daughters now that Victoria had proven Sarah's allegations were correct. But both sisters were cautious about rebuilding trust with parents who had demonstrated their willingness to prioritize wealth over family loyalty. "They want us back now because we're getting positive media attention," Victoria observed during one of their weekly dinners, "but they didn't support us when we were making difficult ethical choices that cost us personally." Sarah agreed, though she left the door open for future reconciliation if their parents demonstrated genuine change rather than opportunistic relationship management. The sisters had built something more valuable than their original family connections, a relationship based on mutual respect, shared values, and authentic support rather than financial dependence or social obligation. Victoria graduated from her paralegal program with highest honors and was immediately hired by a nonprofit organization that provides legal assistance to families dealing with medical fraud. Her work brought meaning and purpose to her life in ways that modeling and social events never had. She developed expertise in healthcare law while helping families navigate the complex legal system to seek justice for fraudulent medical practices. Sarah continued her investigative journalism career, with her coverage of the Whitmore scandal earning her several prestigious awards and job offers from major news organizations. She chose to stay at her current paper, where she had built relationships with sources and editors who supported her commitment to exposing corruption regardless of the personal costs. The sisters bought a small house together in Brooklyn, creating a home that reflected their shared values rather than inherited expectations. Victoria's artistic talents, suppressed for years by family demands for practical achievement, flourished in their new environment. She painted in her spare time, creating works that explored themes of truth, justice, and personal transformation. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat in their garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "Walking away from all that wealth and security?" Victoria considered the question seriously before answering. I regret that it took me so long to understand what was really important. I regret the years I spent living according to other people's expectations instead of my own values. But I don't regret leaving Bradley or standing up to his family. That was the first authentic decision I'd made in years. Sarah understood exactly what her sister meant. The courage to choose truth over comfort, principles over profit, had cost both of them dearly in terms of family relationships and financial security. But it had also given them something more valuable: the ability to respect themselves and each other, the freedom to build lives that aligned with their deepest convictions, and the knowledge that they could face any challenge as long as they faced it together. The Chen sisters had learned that real family isn't defined by blood relationships or shared financial interests, but by mutual support through difficult decisions and shared commitment to living authentically. They had paid a high price for that understanding, but they had also gained something that money couldn't buy: integrity, independence, and the unshakable bond between two people who chose to stand together for what they believed right. 5 years after Sarah first exposed her father's crimes, and 1 year after Victoria called off her wedding to expose her fiancé's corruption, both sisters had built successful careers dedicated to protecting vulnerable people from exactly the kind of exploitation they had experienced in their own family. Their work gave meaning to their sacrifices, turning personal pain into professional purpose and family trauma into social justice. Victoria often spoke to groups about her experience, encouraging other people to trust their moral instincts even when family members or romantic partners pressured them to ignore evidence of wrongdoing. "The people who truly love you will support your integrity," she would tell audiences. "The people who ask you to compromise your values for their benefit don't have your best interests at heart, no matter what they claim." Sarah's investigative work continued to focus on healthcare fraud and institutional corruption, with her reporting leading to numerous prosecutions and policy changes. She had found her calling in exposing the kind of systematic abuse that had once threatened to corrupt her own family, using her skills and platform to protect other people from similar exploitation. The relationship between the Chen sisters became a source of strength and inspiration for both of them, proof that family bonds could survive even the most devastating betrayals if both parties were committed to honesty and growth. They had lost the family they were born into, but they had gained something better: a chosen family built on mutual respect, shared values, and unwavering support for each other's integrity. Victoria graduated from her paralegal program with highest honors and was immediately hired by a nonprofit organization that provides legal assistance to families dealing with medical fraud. Her work brought meaning and purpose to her life in ways that modeling and social events never had. She developed expertise in healthcare law while helping families navigate the complex legal system to seek justice for fraudulent medical practices. Sarah continued her investigative journalism career, with her coverage of the Whitmore scandal earning her several prestigious awards and job offers from major news organizations. She chose to stay at her current paper, where she had built relationships with sources and editors who supported her commitment to exposing corruption regardless of the personal costs. The sisters bought a small house together in Brooklyn, creating a home that reflected their shared values rather than inherited expectations. Victoria's artistic talents, suppressed for years by family demands for practical achievement, flourished in their new environment. She painted in her spare time, creating works that explored themes of truth, justice, and personal transformation. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat in their garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "Walking away from all that wealth and security?" Victoria considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret that it took me so long to understand what was really important. I regret the years I spent living according to other people's expectations instead of my own values. But I don't regret leaving Bradley or standing up to his family. That was the first authentic decision I'd made in years." Sarah understood exactly what her sister meant. The courage to choose truth over comfort, principles over profit, had cost both of them dearly in terms of family relationships and financial security. But it had also given them something more valuable: the ability to respect themselves and each other, the freedom to build lives that aligned with their deepest convictions, and the knowledge that they could face any challenge as long as they faced it together. The Chen sisters had learned that real family isn't defined by blood relationships or shared financial interests, but by mutual support through difficult decisions and shared commitment to living authentically.
They had paid a high price for that understanding, but they had also gained something that money couldn't buy: integrity, independence, and the unshakable bond between two people who chose to stand together for what they believed right. 5 years after Sarah first exposed her father's crimes, and 1 year after Victoria called off her wedding to expose her fiancé's corruption, both sisters had built successful careers dedicated to protecting vulnerable people from exactly the kind of exploitation they had experienced